Hello, folks. How you doing today? Welcome to this session, folks, and I hope you're doing well today. In this session, folks, we're going to work with a grammar structure that probably you may have seen before, right? But today we're going to explore it in a little more depth, right? And I'm talking about unreal past conditionals. Before we start, folks, I want you to think about something. If you have ever looked back at a situation in your life and thought, for example, if you have ever looked like I could have done something differently. Maybe you didn't study enough for the exam, but maybe you didn't take an opportunity, or perhaps you made a decision and later wonder what the result would have been if he had made a different choice, right? Well, let me tell you, folks, that the English language gives us a very useful grammatical structure to talk about exactly those situations that we expressed in the past, right? Throughout this session, folks, we're going to see how unreal past conditionals are formed, what they mean, when do we have to use them, and how we can use them naturally in different contexts, right? Let's start it with this, folks. First of all, folks, let's understand the basic idea. I'm pretty sure that you got some knowledge about this one because in previous sessions we were discussing okay about this one. But let me tell you that when we talk about an unreal past conditional, we're talking about a situation in the past that didn't actually happen, right? So that's the key idea. It didn't happen, right? We're basically imagining an alternative version of the past. For example, imagine that yesterday I had an important meeting, but I arrived late because I woke up late, right? So, what is the reality? I woke up late, so I arrived late, right? But later I might think, if I had woken up earlier, I would have arrived on time. Notice what I'm doing here. I'm not changing reality. I cannot get back and change what happened. I'm simply imagining a different past in at a different consequence, right? So that's why, the folks, that we call it unreal. The situation we're describing is contrary to what actually happened, right? So in this structure is particularly useful when we're talking about things such as regrets, missed opportunities, alternative consequences, or simply reflecting on previous decisions, right? So, as you can see here, folks, this isn't just another grammar formula that we need to memorize. It's actually a structure that allows us to communicate some fairly complex idea, right? Especially at an advanced level of English, so that the same level that you have, right? Now that we understand the general idea, folks, about unreal past conditionals, let's look how we actually construct these sentences, right? Let's focus on the structure, folks, please. Remember that an unreal past conditional normally has two parts, right? Or even two clauses, right? First, we have the if clause. In this part, we're going to use the past perfect. So we have if plus subject plus had plus past participle, right? And when we have the second part, which is the result or consequence, we're going to use would have plus past participle. So putting everything together, our basic pattern for these types of conditional is if plus had plus past participle, then we got woulda plus past participle. Let's look at some example as you can appreciate on the screen, folks. If he had studied harder, you would have passed the exam. Let's break that down, folks. If he had studied harder, that's the imaginary past situation, right? What does that tell us about reality? Well, you probably didn't study enough, right? And then we have in the main class, you would have passed the exam. That's the imaginary results, right? And what probably happened in reality, you didn't pass the exam, right? So there's something important here, folks. When you hear an unreal past conditional, try to think about the opposite reality behind the sentence, right? The sentence says, if he had studied harder, you would have passed. But the reality is, you didn't study hard enough, s- and you didn't pass, right? Understanding that contrast will help you use this structure much more naturally, right? Now, let's take a closer look at those two parts, folks. The first part, as I mentioned before, the if clause contains the imaginary conditions, right? For example, if I had known, if she had studied, if they had arrived earlier, all of those use the past perfect. If you listen carefully, so I was mentioning the past perfect, right? Then the second part tells us about the imaginary consequences or the imaginary results. I would have called you, she would have passed, they would have seen the presentation. So think about this in this way, folks. The first clause answers what could have been different, and the second clause answers what would the consequence would have been. For example, if I had known about the problem, I would have helped you. What could have been different? I could have known about the problem and what the consequences had been. I would have helped you, right? But again, neither of those things happened, right? I didn't know the problem, and consequently, I didn't help. Another important element here is the past participle. As you notice, as you heard, so when using this structure, folks, we need to be comfortable with both regular and irregular past participle. I would say that past participle of all of those verbs is the most complicated part for students understanding better the conditionals, right? The perspective conditional that we get, right? Now now that you know the structure, folks, the question is, when do we actually use it? When do we actually use unreal past condition? Well, here, as you can appreciate on the screen, folks, there are several situations. Okay, one of one of the most is regret. Okay, regret. Imagine that I say, if I had studied more, I would have gotten a better grade. Maybe I'm expressing regret because I know I could have prepared better, right? We can also use unreal past conditional, folks, when discussing hypothetical consequences, right? For example, if the company had invested earlier, it would have increased its profits. Here, we're analyzing an alternative business decision, right? We can even use the structure in academic context. Imagine we're discussing history. If a, if a particular historical event hadn't occurred, the political situation might have developed differently. We're not saying, folks, that this actually happened, right? We're analyzing an alternative possibility. And of course, we can use the structure for personal reflections, right? For example, if I had accepted that opportunity, my life would have been different, right? So here's something I'd like you to think about it. Can you remember one past decision that you would have changed if you had that opportunity? Think for a second, folks, and then try to express the idea using a real past conditional. Probably you could begin with if I had, and that would sound good, right? But now Let's look at some additional examples. As you can appreciate here, folks, we got some examples that we're going to examine together, right? To see how flexible this structure can be, right? First, let's see the first one. If I had known about the job opening, I would applied immediately. Now I ask you, what's the reality? I didn't know about the job opening, right? So I didn't apply. Let's see next sample. If she had listened to the advice, she wouldn't have made that mistake. Now I ask you again, what's the reality in that sentence? She probably didn't listen to the advice, right? And she made a mistake. Let's see the other one. If they had invested in technology earlier, they would have dominated the market, right? This one could easily appear in a business or professional context, right? And then, if he had attended the conference, you would have learned valuable skills. What is the reality? What do you think is the reality there? You did attend the conference, right? So you missed that learning opportunity. And finally, we got it. If we had communicated better, we could have avoided the conflict, right? I particularly like this example, folks, because it shows that unreal past conditional are useful when we reflect on situations, right? And identify what could have been done differently. Notice that although the grammatical pattern remains basically the same, right? The contexts are completely different: employment, personal decisions, business, education, and communication. That's why, folks, learning the structure is important, but learning how to use it meaningfully is even more important, right? Now, let's see some things that get a little more interesting. So, the variation that we got in these ones. We've mainly been using woulda, right? But woulda isn't only our only option that we got. Depending on what we want to communicate, we can also use forms such as could have, might have, and all of the modal verbs, right? But in this case, in past, modal verbs in past. Let's look at the first example that we got. If I had seen him, I could have asked for help, right? Here, as you can appreciate there, folks, could have emphasizes an opportunity or possibility. This is depend on the kind of use that every modal verb has, right? I didn't see him, so I didn't have the opportunity to ask him. Now compare that with I- if it had rained, the game might have been cancelled. Here might have tell us that the result wasn't certain, right? Maybe the game would have been canceled, maybe not. So we have a degree of uncertainty. So when we use might, right? That's an important distinction. Would have generally presented the imagined results more directly, could have often expresses possibility or ability, and might have expresses a less certain possibility, right? But in the past, okay? Don't forget that all of them are in the past, right? So, as your English becomes more advanced, folks, don't think of grammar only in terms of correct or incorrect. Start thinking about meaning and nuance, right? For example, I don't know if you have wondered yourself, why did the speaker choose might have instead of would have when you listen to these kind of sentences? That type of question helps you move, right? From simply knowing grammar to actually using it effectively. But the problem is that not all of the students quite know how to use modal verbs in past, right? Even in present is so tough for them. Let's see, folks, here some of the mistakes that most of students frequently make. For example, we got, if I would have known, I would have called you. Does that sound familiar for you? You may hear something similar in informal communication, right, on the street, but for the grammatical pattern, for the grammatical academic pattern we're studying, that's not the structure we want, right? So the correct form, as you can appreciate it on the screen, folks, we got, if I had known, I would have called you. Remember, once again, folks, remember, after if, we need the past perfect. So we got if plus had plus past participle, right? Not if plus would have. No. Let's look at another common mistake. If she studied harder, she would have passed. What's missing? What's missing there, folks? Probably you're thinking in the past perfect, and that's really good and that's really fine, right? So we need, if she had studied harder, she would have passed. A useful strategy, folks, is to check your sentence in two parts. First, ask, do I have had plus past participle in my if clause? Check the sentence and then ask yourself, do I have woulda plus past participle in my result clause? If the answer, folks, is yes, you're probably on the right track, right? So remember the simple rule. Don't put would have directly after if the standard and real past conditional patterns. Remember that something that we have discussed in previous session, folks, is that every, and all of we said, it's that every conditional has its own structure, right? So we need to identify the tenses and the structure in each parts. That the parts are the same for all of the conditional. If clause or if condition plus main clause or main results, right? But the structure that we use in each element, in each part, are totally different, right? Now let's move on, folks, on one step further. As I said before, if you're taking Grammar 5, folks, is because you got an advanced level. So you're going to encounter some variations of conditional structure, and one of them is the mixed conditional, right? Please pay attention to this, folks, because next session we're going to work in a practical class, in a practical summative class, right? For example, if he had studied, you would be confident now. Notice something interesting here, folks. The condition refers to the past, right? If he had studied, but the consequence refers to the present, you would be confident now. So we're connecting a past situation with a present consequence. Another advanced form is inversion. Instead of saying, if he had known, you would have acted differently. We can say, had you known, you would have you would have acted differently. Notice that if disappears, right? Because we're using comma. This form is more formal and is particularly useful to recognize in academic or professional writing, right? We can also find, folks, implied conditionals where the condition isn't explicitly stated, right? For example, I would have helped you with that project. The listener probably, you may understand an implied condition such as, if I had known you needed help. So at higher professional levels that some of you have, folks, conditional meaning isn't always presented through the basic if plus right structure. That's why it's important, folks, not only to produce the basic form, but also to recognize those variations when you encounter them in authentic text or conversations, right? Now it's your turn, folks. It's your turn to apply what we've discussed, right? We have three sentences on the screen, as you can appreciate there, folks. And your task is to complete each one using the appropriate and real past conditional form. Let's do the first one together, right? If he had prepared for the presentation, you more confident. Look at the first folks, the first clause folks. We already have if he had prepared. So our condition is correctly formed, right? Now we need the imaginary results. The verb that we're gonna use for completing that sentence is feel. Okay. So what should we say, folks? You would have felt more confident, right? That would be the right answer. Number two, folks. If the weather better, we would have gone hiking. Look at the result clause, would have gone, right? That tell us we're dealing with an unreal past condition. Situation, sorry. Past situation. So in the if clause, folks, we need the past perfect of be if the weather had been better, right? Let's see the number three. If she had known the truth, she differently. We already have the past perfect in the first clause, had known, so we need if she had known the truth, she would have reacted differently, right? But I don't want you to focus only on getting the correct answer. Ask yourself, folks, why? Why each answer is correct? Remember that we're working with unreal past conditionals, and sometimes we have to mix different structures of some conditionals there, right? So, folks, that has been all for today. If you got any doubts about this content, we can discuss in next class, right? You have to be ready, folks, with this one because this was explanations only. And as I said before, in next session on Sunday, we're going to make a practical summative activity. Okay, we're gonna work directly with that one. So before doing the assignment, folks, next class, and if you got some doubts, ask first, and then we're gonna work on the documents, right? So that has been all for today, folks, and see you. Bye bye. See you next class.